My name is Julie Brissett. I'm currently directing the Florida Space Institute here at UCF. And today we're gathered for, I was told to first start by saying the event will be recorded and the recording will be posted on the Public Policy Event webpage. So today we're assembled for a great panel entitled Beyond Earth, A Role in Space Exploration Policy and the Public Good. We're in Orlando, so that's a really great place to be when if we are interested in space these days. We're really at the cornerstone, of Kennedy Space Center launching all these rockets, great universities in the corridor in Central Florida, UCF being a big one. And then also all these companies that are setting up shop on the coast to build all their satellites and hardware. So this is a great place to be for talking about space and the future of space exploration. And space, as we have all come to know, is no longer just agencies, no longer just countries and, individual entities that are going, not just astronauts, but it's just commercial companies, international collaborations. So there is a whole new world opening up there. And so we have assembled today a great panel of experts to have a chat about, how this is going to benefit expansion of humanity into space, how we will ensure that exploration of space serves the public good, and then, what guardrails do we need to prevent space from becoming the next arena of inequality and conflict? So today with us we have I'll do it in the row here. So we have Michelle Hanlon, Executive Director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Space Law, who will be offering critical insights into space governance and legal frameworks. We have Dr. Greg Autry, Space Czar and Associate Provost for Space Commercialization and Strategy at the University of Central Florida, bringing deep expertise in space policy and commercial innovation. We have Melanie McComb, Assistant State Attorney for Hillsborough County, Missouri, specializing in legal and regulatory perspectives that intersect with emerging space activities. We have Dr. Carrie Dawson-Hanna, Associate Professor at UCF's Department of Physics, whose research focuses on lunar geology and planet surface processes. We have Dr. Amy Gregory, Faculty Fellow for Space Tourism Programming and Initiatives, and Interim Chair of Food Service and Lodging Management at UCF Rosen College, exploring the future of hospitality and tourism beyond Earth. Dr. Philip Metzger, Director of the Stephen Hawking Center for Microgravity Research and Education and Research Professor at the Florida Space Institute at UCF, known for his pioneering work on planetary science and ISRU. So thanks a lot. I'm humbled by, all this expertise assembled at this table. And I will go straight into our opening question. How do we ensure that space exploration serves the public good rather than just private interest? What kind of guardrails need to be in place? Who wants to start? Dr. Autry.
I believe that the private interests are the public good, and if we follow the European assumption that the very first question is what guardrails do we need to put into place, then we'll do what the Europeans do, which is mostly nothing.
Everything that we do in space has already proven to benefit all of humanity. And so when we think about how do we make sure everyone's involved, how we make everything beneficial, sorry, I got in late last night, is to recognize, okay, so the first satellites were for war, right? Surveillance. But what did that bring us? That brought us Earth observation. And what has that done? That's saved countless lives, right? And given us countless other insights into infrastructure and so forth. So when we think about space and we think about how it's going to benefit, and we think about the Outer Space Treaty, which says we must benefit all of humanity, we don't want to think about, okay, what am I doing today? How's it going to benefit humanity in the next hour or tomorrow, right? You need to think about the long term. And so when we start mining the lunar surface, or when we start finding asteroids where we can get rare earth elements, we'll start putting data centers in space, that is going to benefit everybody on Earth. And so I agree. We don't need guardrails. We need more support rail.
And Gautam? So have you said we call that? Then
Com check. Okay, there we go. So I think that we're entering an age where economic activity is going to begin growing very large off of planet Earth. And I've been modeling this, and in my own modeling, it predicts that within about 60 years, there could be as much economic activity in space as there is in the entire global economy on Earth. So that's the type of scale we're talking about. And that introduces some major issues for the public good, because the industry will be largely robotic, autonomous, all capital, no labor, for the most part. And the question is, who owns it, and how much power will those few individuals have, if they own as much value as the entire gross world product? And so I think it's really crucial that we democratize space and create methods for all people on the Earth to have ownership in this activity that we do beyond the Earth.
And then I would offer that people are curious, right? Humans are curious, and there's an opportunity to go to a new frontier. There's a reason why tourism is an important component for any society. It generates an awful lot of revenue. It generates growth, but it also has to be protected and sustainable. And so that's where the hospitality component of that whole tourism mechanism comes together, to ensure that not only those that are going and staying, but also where they're going, that all of that remains sustainable and protected so that it's thriving.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of what both of you said is, I think for it to really benefit society, we have to make it accessible to society. And so that means creating opportunities so that anyone that wants to do something in space, whether it's through tourism or science or technology development, everyone has access to that, because that's really what's going to drive benefits to society.
And I'm going to build off everyone else. Speaking from a prosecutorial sense, I think accountability is the way forward in order to protect our private industry that's moving into space, as well as our governments and private actors. We need a sense of accountability to make sure that the framework is consistent, universally applicable, and it guarantees predictability for our companies to grow and rely on that infrastructure. I also think it's interesting with something research that I've been conducting is the concept of urban designing in right now Earth's orbit. If we have the first actor in space design Earth's orbit without input from everybody else, then they are essentially going to lay the rules of the road just by taking up space. And so I think that we need to have a conversation about how that actually works moving forward, and holding, making sure liability and accountability are followed through. In order to conceptualize it, I've thought about the Earth's orbit is a canvas. And right now we have a bunch of different painters trying to finish their masterpiece and what they want space to look like. But eventually those masterpieces are going to start colliding with each other. And when that happens, we need the framework to be able to hold accountability and liability to protect and ensure growth and sustainability.
So I heard that, thank you so much. The topic are, equity and access came up. So how should we think about equity and access in space exploration? Is there a path beyond space being only for nations and billionaires? So what are your thoughts on that? literally billionaires are the people that are able to go right now financially that are not nation.
You're right. When humanity spread around the globe, we always went as communities. So, for example, when the first humans came into the Americas over the Bering Land Bridge, it's like 20,000 years ago, the entire community, not just explorers and not just the elite members of that society, but the whole community did. The problem with going to space is that it's very expensive and it requires spaceships and habitat and spacesuits, which the vast majority of us can't afford. And so we need to be really intentional so that we can go together as a community. And I think I don't know the solution to this. I feel it's an unsolved problem, but I think academia has a role in trying to create on-ramps of participation. But I honestly don't have a solution to that yet.
Okay. But so I'm not sure. Yeah.
Was this working? Okay. Yeah, I have zero interest in equity. The history of equity basically has always resulted in everybody being equally poor. And I would say, I don't think, Phil, that we can assert that everybody in the community crossed the Bering Sea to come to North America. We have no idea. I do suspect there were people who were perfectly happy wherever they were in Asia, and other people, for whatever reasons, were excluded, thrown out, or felt that there was a better horizon for them to chase. And yes, they did take a community with them, but it was a community of the willing. And there were certainly people who did not want to go and didn't want to cross a glacier to go somewhere else and kill all the animals in North America like they did. So in my mind, we need to make sure that you have these on-ramps and everybody has opportunities. But if we delay the entire process by trying to make it perfect, then I think we're going to find perfect is the enemy of good enough. And we'll miss the opportunity, at least for a few generations, to raise everybody's boats and standard of living, because that giant economy happening in space is going to benefit everybody on Earth, even if, God forbid, it's disproportionate. And darn it, there are some trillionaires.
I love our billionaires, and I thank God for them every day, because they're spending their own money. They're not spending taxpayer money. Sure, they're getting some money. The government is one of their biggest clients, but we're not putting the bill for every Falcon Heavy that doesn't survive, right? I always liken this period of space travel to the turn of the 1900, when we first got flight, right? The first airplanes were really, really expensive to fly. The first flight, people didn't go from one city to another. They paid a lot of money in order to go into the air and have lunch and then land back at the same airport. So these are really, really rich people, and that's what they did. Sounds a lot like really, really rich people going into not quite orbit for 9 seconds of low gravity, right? So yeah, of course, I'm jealous. Of course, these people have a lot of money, and it looks like these people are sort of going to be taking over space. But look what happened to air travel. My ticket from Memphis to here was less than $100. This is how it travel and exploration will evolve. Yeah, people have to take a risk. Let them take the risk with their own money. Eventually, maybe I won't get to the moon, but I know my kids will.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out, Sharon Hagel will be speaking over next door in the exchange at BA1 this afternoon, and she's flown twice to space on her own money. They won't say how much it is, but we know it's more than $1 million a ticket.
I think there's a distinction between exploration and settlement, and I believe academia does have a role in all of that. I also agree with Dr. Autry that let them go. Let's do proof of concept. Let those things happen. The more individuals do, again, following airplane flight, the more likely it will become available to others, if it's viable, if it's meaningful, if it makes sense, right? So the difference between exploration and settlement, and that back to what you were saying, there's going into the new frontier in terms of exploration, which I think is what's happening a lot right now.
versus the purposeful settlement, which is where that sustainability and that community and all comes together. And I will show like a difference with these by travel is that nowadays, the rich person goes, they can take a camera with them, they can show pictures, they can share with the community, that they went. So there's this kind of piggyback experience that they can have if they're very excited about it, before maybe someday they do themselves. I great advice. Anybody else in the question? Okay, no problem. So what do you think is the biggest gap between where state policy is today and where it used to be? Are we moving fast enough, or perhaps too fast in some areas?
I think that the law will never be able to catch up with innovation, but that's okay. And I do think that right now the gap between policy where it is today and where we would like it to be when humans do eventually enter space in a settlement for maybe just cohabiting orbit for a short period of time. These are situations that none of us have experienced yet. The people that we currently send are psychologically evaluated, and then they're put into these extreme situations where they're able to handle it a little bit. Once this becomes more accessible, we need to start thinking about crime does follow humanity, and we need to have an infrastructure to be able to support that and protect people. So we lead into the question of jurisdiction, but should we have jurisdiction? Because then that leads into questions of speedy trial and the time it will take to travel back from Mars, the right to confrontation, the cost of prosecution. Does the nation want to take that on? We have varying thoughts about criminal law, and we have Sharia law versus common law versus civil law, and many other types of law. So we need to start thinking about how are we going to protect the people that when they do go to space and things inevitably do happen.
So, we have law in space already. We have an outer space treaty. We can hold all of space law in our hands. So, thank you. Yeah, I did that this time. You have to get them online. So we have a framework already. We know that international law applies in space. We know that we can't put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction anywhere in space. We know we have to conduct our activities in space with due regard for the corresponding interests of others. Now we just have to figure out what all that gobbledygook means, right? And so that's what we have a framework. And I think I'm just going to reiterate, people ask me all the time, what would be the first law you impose on the moon? Well, I have no clue. I've never been to the moon. I have no idea what the law should be on the moon. And I shouldn't be making the law on the moon. We have this framework that's this international law applies in space. I will note that includes the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which I have to do this every time I am on a panel, which says that all humans have the right to own property, and we do not lose that right in space. And so, yeah, we have a lot of things to work out and a lot of regulation. Oh my God, the heyday lawyers are going to have with criminal activity. It's like, sweet dreams. But there is a framework there, and we're excited to start getting into it.
Yeah, I think that the biggest haul is the property rights issue. We just had a really good speaker with Space Settlement talk about that topic. And as she noted, the right to property is a human right according to the United Nations. But within the Outer Space Treaty, you have this little bit of ambiguity. And you mentioned, what are you going to do with the criminal on Mars? Ship them back to Earth for trial? I don't think so. The people on Mars are going to be sovereign, and they will rule themselves and adjudicate their own disputes and enforce them in the long run, because it's just not practical otherwise. And we saw that in human history. Colonies that are very, very, very far away just don't last. It's not a practical thing. So we should think about that in advance and find a mechanism to allow for sovereignty, because without sovereignty, you've got the Wild West. And so if the assumption is, for instance, on the moon, that no nation can claim territory, which you have in the Outer Space Treaty, then who can issue a claim basically to property and adjudicate dispute between two claims and go enforce it? Nobody. And so we've got a situation where certain governments, I suspect the Chinese government, will draw dotted lines around things because they like doing that. They'll be very, very thick dotted lines. And then some commercial actor who may be multinational, right? I mean, you could see corporations like Apple building spacecraft. What happens when that spacecraft interferes with a Chinese national product or a state-owned industry? I don't know. I mean, don't say to me, oh, that's the America's problem, because Apple has a headquarters in Cupertino, but the majority of people who make their products are probably in China, right? And their stockholders are all over the world. And so I don't personally feel I'm responsible for them. So that's going to be a really interesting world.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've been following the news that Elon has been announcing, but just to show you why the property rights issue is going to be so important, just the last 24 hours, he has made a major shift to where he's not going to skip the moon and only go to Mars. He said he's going to lean in heavily on the moon. He wants to develop manufacturing on the moon to build AI systems that will then be shot off the moon using mass drivers. So basically, the world's greatest von Braunian has just become an O'Neillian. People are shocked about this. But the upside of AI could be limitless. It could grow to the sky. Some people are saying it's going to coat the entire world with solar panels. I don't think that. I think it'll be restricted from building out on the Earth that much, and the political and economic pressures will force it to build in space. And that's why Elon, Bezos, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, bought Relativity Space, a rocket company. They're all saying it's to put AI in space.
Founded by my former students.
Really?
Jim,
awesome.
Tim Ellison, Jordan,
Yes.
we're my students at USC.
So they're talking about 10 years from now, putting the first AI servers in space, not 100 years. And I ran numbers on this myself. Like, what are the environmental impact costs? What's the trend? What are the delay costs? Cost of delay for permitting and local political approval? Draw a trend line, compare that the trend line of launch costs coming down, and they cross in 10 years. I don't know if I believe that, but we're not talking a century. We're talking about this decades, to where there's going to be this gigantic amount of economic activity. But how do you do that on the moon if you don't have some sort of law, some sort of jurisdiction to have law enforcement? And I think there's a lot of big issues that have to be worked out.
And it's also interesting to consider who's going to have property rights on resources, because we know that one of the reasons why people are interested in going to the lunar surface is identifying where we might have water or other resources that will only enable further exploration of the solar system. And so how are we going to determine who gets access to those resources? Is it the first person or the first country that identifies the location of those resources? If that's the case, are we all in a huge race to make sure that we identify water and ice and at the South Pole? It certainly sets up something to consider as well.
So what happens when interests collide in space? So this is just moving along, the discussion here. Scientific research versus commercial mining, that's a nice one. But it could also just be, China versus US, or this company versus that company. So a little bit along the lines of what you said. So, our legal frameworks for that really going to be decided on site, or should we pre-work on those or see what happens? What is your take on it? And then get some, regulation going on.
Yeah, to follow up where I left it, that concerns me. And again, you've got the Apple issue versus, say, a Chinese science station. And, Apple located their global headquarters in Cork, Ireland, to avoid income tax for many years. I don't think we have a way to deal with this. And it's a really important conversation that I don't think we'll solve here. But we need to have that conversation in the U.S. in particular. I think needs to engage more on it. We have an Office of Space Affairs in the State Department. And I think that they need to be a little more foot forward. So whoever might take the leadership position there, I hope knows what they're doing.
Yeah, and this is one of the criticisms or the downfall of public international law, right? We have all these wonderful laws, but then Russia invades Ukraine, and what do? We're like, oh, that was bad. You're bad. China built islands in the South China Seas and, decks out Philippine fishermen. Bad. You're really bad. So yeah, we've got to figure out how to turn bad into something enforceable. But I'll tell you what the United States has done that is a huge leap forward is the Artemis Accords. We have now 59 nations that are basically allied with the United States and the interpretation of the U.S. interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. I say U.S., but these are the Artemis Accords were negotiated amongst sort of 7 core nations, and these sort of set a blueprint, if you will, for how we're going to interpret the law, how we're going to deal with conflict. We're going to have safety zones and moving forward like that. And so when I talked about this Outer Space Treaty and this concept of due regard, what does due regard mean? That's what we have to figure out. And we have to start putting up these sort of guidelines. And we can only do that, though, if we all agree. And this is where, this is that sort of funny dichotomy balance, right? We need to share information about the plume effect that Dr. Metzger is working on so much. What happens when you land on the moon? Because China is not going to trust U.S. Figures, and U.S. isn't going to trust China figures. But if we can at least share some of that science the way we did with debris mitigation, we have all sorts of examples in international law where we do try and share. But then, something is going to happen. And whether we have Space Force, running around in shuttles, gunning other people down, or, which is perfectly legal. Outer space is not to be used exclusively for peace purposes. The moon and other celestial bodies are, but the Outer Space Treaty falls short of prohibiting conventional weapons in space or battles in space. So these are things we have to deal with as we want to protect commercial space.
Artemis Accords are a great example of that collaboration and at least recognizing and understanding and beginning those conversations. I don't believe that they have all the right answers, but they've agreed to work together to make that happen. Dr. Autry used the example of Apple. I'll use a hospitality example. The Marriott Corporation going and establishing regional offices and operations in China. They have to do that within a certain way of operating and organizing, and it needs to make sense for them as a business and an entity that's profitable and responsible to shareholders to make that happen. So I recognize that there is bad out there, but I also hope for the good, and I see more of that collaboration. We see crazy things that are going on the bad side and the good side within multiple nations these days. So I hope for the good that comes in collaboration. And it will probably be difficult also to be a single nation deciding on things. So the Artemis Accords are a great, example where the U.S. took the lead to bring the international community together. But that kind of leaves the enforcement question. Who brought that up? I think it was you, Michelle. Enforcement question open. What's going to happen? Is it bad, or do we need to create a space NATO of some sort?
So I would say, we are in a really unique period in history right now because our commercial industry generally is involved in space because they love space. It's not about profit right now. It's about, oh my God, we are going to be O'Neill or Von Braun, or we're going to go and build these things, or we were inspired by Apollo. So we have this window where we have mostly good actors. I'd say the largest percent of good actors that we will ever have in space. So now's the time, and this is a plea that I have to commercial industry, is, what? Let's all have the same provision in our contracts, which we do across corporate contracts, right? We will all do if we have a dispute, we will all go to a certain arbitral body, wherever it may be. There's one in the UAE, there's a space arbitration through the UN, or create a new one, or just create a different body, or create a very simple set of rules. Because we don't want, tons of regulations, but what we need to do is go to the same place with our conflicts so that we build a body of law and tradition with respect to those conflicts so that not every conflict is going to be a brand new issue?
I would caution against the wisdom of creating international multilateral bodies to adjudicate these disputes based on the fact that history shows us when you include nations that don't respect democracy and the democratic organization, and I think of, say, the UN, the International Olympic Committee, the World Health Organizations, the autocratic nations, and I'll name them, most specifically Russia and China, have a way of using smaller countries that they have influence over as their tools to achieve their ends. And, there's a reason there was a Winter Olympics in Beijing where there's no snow, as the Chinese just bought out all these little Pacific islands and other people to do what they wanted. And they did the same thing with the WHO during COVID, to make sure that everybody thought China wasn't responsible for COVID. So we've got to be realistic about that. And I think the U.S. in particular needs to be realistic. But the Artemis Accords, I think, is a good step. I don't know that we need everybody on board, but we need the nations that are actually effective to have enough authority for those that choose not to get on board to stand up to them if that should be necessary. And I know that's not always appealing to everybody, but I think that's the reality. And then a quote attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt I like is that the future belongs to those who show up. So there's a lot of nations that aren't going to show up. I'd love to make sure that they come along, but to Phil's point, if we have an economy bigger than the global economy on Earth, it's going to return huge value to them. They already, for instance, have Starlink. Did you ever think about that? I just took a ship from Costa Rica to Tahiti earlier this year across the most empty part of the globe. There's nothing in the eastern Pacific other than the Galapagos and East Ireland. And my connection there was so perfect that people at UCF didn't know that I wasn't in my office, right? That has changed the world from sub-Saharan Africa across Oceania, across all parts of Asia and Latin America where there's not connectivity. It is now available. Now we need to make it economically available, but it's awesome.
All right. So let's shift a little bit more towards, the work ahead. What are the most significant challenges, whether scientific, medical, legal, or logistical, that people don't realize we need to solve before space becomes truly accessible?
All of them.
There's an obvious human component, in my mind anyway, that we've had astronauts going up to this point who have trained, been observed before, during, and after for long periods of time. We'll be sending regular people. Not sending, we'll be going, electing to go. Regular people like you and I, and all that comes along with that. So, as somebody said earlier today, that there's a constant sensing of things happening, which is going to rely predominantly on AI in the future, as opposed to the group at Houston that are watching and monitoring everybody that's up there. So I think that's a huge thing we can't underestimate.
So you're saying we need to make space comfortable.
We need to make it for people comfortable, yes, but we also need to be keenly aware, and we know of some of the horrible things that happen with radiation and a variety of other things. But yes, how we make it so that individuals aren't just living, but that they're thriving.
Safe and comfortable.
Safe and comfortable, yes.
To go back to the example of air flight, it was not comfortable. But Howard Hughes, he saw the problem. He said people are not going to fly in these airplanes if they're going to be sick every time. So he found technical solution. So,
and I'd like to point out it wasn't safe earlier in air travel either. I am old enough to tell you that when I was a kid and we traveled, there was a machine in the airport, and you went and you filled out a form about your flight number, and you put $10 or $20 into this envelope in the machine and bought insurance for in case you died on that airplane. It would pay off your family's $5,000 or something. That actually existed. And it was routine in the late 60s and early 70s for aircraft to be hijacked or explode like every month. There was an airliner that went down, I would say, every month in that period of time. And we kept getting on them.
And to be comfortable in space, it means we need to be able to build things in space that will give us those luxuries or those comforts. And, that means we have to figure out how to build things in space and how to get equipment into space to build those things, because we can't launch everything from the surface. If we want to be in space, either on the moon or going well past the moon and Mars, we need to be there for extended periods of time. And so we need the capabilities of humans being in space for that long, the suits and the resources to be able to do that, but then also to live, food, all these things. Gravity, there's lots of things to think about.
I would like to echo everybody on the panel that comfortability, and I would love to see humanity thrive in outer space, because if they're not thriving, then ultimately when resources are low and scarce, then unfortunately bad things do happen. And crime can be as simple as throwing an empty Pepsi bottle at somebody because you got frustrated with them, or it could escalate from there. So I think that
throwing an empty Pepsi bottle into orbit, that's pretty bad.
That's also pretty bad, yes.
If you're fast.
So that I would say legal, science, everything is really important.
Community is going to be a huge part of all of that. And the hospitality ecosystem underlies all of that. But I think it's also fair to recognize that a new culture will be developed. So I talk about a very basic explanation of culture. My family was brought up one way, my husband's family was brought up another way, and the two of us married. We created a unique third culture that borrowed from each of these two cultures. But this is what what our family knows and what my boys know and how they interact. So I think the recognition of that culture and how we feed that culture, understanding community and what draws people together, and basic needs are essential. If those go awry, people start to act silly. And so we get that back in order. But there's an awful lot of exploration, wonderment, an awful lot of good that can be done. And I think the ecosystem that supports all of that needs to be very well protected.
Until someday they declare independence up there.
So what the question you asked is very broad. There's so much that we need to do to adapt to economic and human life activities beyond planet Earth. But I'd like to add a philosophical thought to put it in perspective. Here on the Earth, we are adapted to being part of our biosphere. We're part of a food chain, and we live on a planet that is unique for supporting biology because of the unique geology that produces certain minerals and topsoil, and there's atmosphere and water. When we go beyond planet Earth, there aren't places like the Earth in our solar system, and maybe not even in a lot of the surrounding stars. So we're going to rely on machinery to fulfill the role of the ecosphere and the environment that Earth provides naturally. And so we're basically developing a robotic food chain that starts with basic minerals that are not the good minerals we have on Earth, and converts them into everything we need so that humans can live as humans without spending all of our time working on repairing robots. And so it's going to be a huge amount of technology development to make that possible. But it is straightforward industrial engineering. I think we're going to get it done in a fairly short amount of time over the coming decades. But basically everything about how we live our lives has to be re-engineered.
Work ahead for the community. All right. So, here at UCF, we're at we're a university. So what role do you think university and public institutions should play in shaping our future in space? And how do we maintain public investment alongside private innovation?
So I think the biggest role for academia, for universities, is awareness raising. Events like this where people come in because there's a free lunch and are open up to the concept of space are really important. I can't tell you how many times I tell people I'm a space lawyer and they think I'm in real estate. This is, that space is the future. And we need to, this goes back to your very first question. How do we get people involved in space? How do we make sure we have more voices? That is our job as academics, is to bring students in and get them to fall in love with space the way we have. Also I kept myself out of the last question because, there's just way too many lawyer jokes. But just get rid of them, right? Yeah. We have this unknown, and I liken us to, and it's a tough one, but like Christopher Columbus, when he went to Ferdinand and Isabel, right? He said, I'm going to go the wrong way around the earth and find India, right? And they were like, okay, crazy guy, here's some money, go do it and leave us alone. And he bumped into North America. And what happened? We got Elvis, McDonald's, baseball, and a host of other things. And we also got problems. But no way anybody in Europe in the 1400s thought that Christopher Columbus was going to be the genesis of the creation of the greatest democracy, democratic republic the world has ever seen. Space has just such endless opportunity for everybody, for chefs, for lawyers, for engineers, for beauticians, for biologists. I mean, everything we do on Earth, we're going to need to do in space, and it's going to be 5 times as hard. So we need to bring our A game, and that is what we need to do at these universities, is prepare our students and make sure they can play the A game.
Okay, what do you call it when you throw a space lawyer out of the airlock? A good start. I just want to say, one of the things academics can do is this conversation and say the hard things and the provocative things. I like saying provocative things. You might have noticed that, because we can. And it's not something that a lot of political people or commercial people can do, because they're not protected by the supposed dome of free speech we're in, and we have that responsibility to say these hard things at each other and talk robustly about it. So thank you, Julie, for making us do that.
This is also the time, not only for the professors, but for the students as well, to go back to the origination of what we do as academics and researchers, right? Is to explore, to find support or lack of support for something. So I think there's obviously the educational component as we deal with our students of 18 to however, old. And then also to engage them in the research that we're doing based on questions and conversations that they have, or hypotheses that we've begun to develop, to continue to move all of that forward. And then that we bring back into the classroom to inform or re-inform the education that we're providing in the future. So definitely the awareness, but that education as a foundation, and then the research that continues to inform and move us forward.
And do you think that we have a role in keeping public entities engaged, or not at all? You kind of said, exploring and see what hits, what doesn't hit.
Well, I'm in a very applied research area. So yes, I would say we very much need to stay close to the public to understand what it is that they're doing. Also, again, to inform
public dollars.
Yes. Well, that helped as well, right? Yes, grants and contracts are very helpful. But yeah, I think for us to operate in a vacuum outside of what's practically occurring would not be just.
I think the education system is pivotal for the future. We need to foster the talent that's coming up. So public awareness and getting into even high schools and middle schools to build the skills to be able to excel and push us.
And I think universities also have a unique opportunity, because we can work with federal agencies and private companies and look at building new technologies that get us further into space and giving students opportunities to get hands-on experience with doing those things. And certainly if you want to excite students and get people involved, having them participate in even small ways is a great way to do that. And so the university environment is the perfect place for bringing all of those things together.
Great. So what gives each of you optimism about humanity's future beyond Earth? This will be our kind of closing question. So what milestones or developments are you most excited to see in the next decade? Phil, why don't you start?
Okay, in the next decade, that's pretty short. I spent a lot of time thinking about 20 to 50 years. But we've seen the launch costs coming way down, and as that occurs, and as we get competition from other launch providers bringing the cost down, it should create a lot more opportunity for activity beyond planet Earth. I think the space tourism will have a virtuous cycle. As more people go, the costs come down, then even more can go. And I'm excited about moving industry outside of Earth's gravity field out into space in order to benefit planet Earth. And I'm really excited to see the progress that we're making in that direction.
I'm excited about the wonderment and the fandom that supports this entire area. There's an awful lot of wonder, limitless at this point, but there's this huge group of individuals that are fans, whether they're directly involved or indirectly involved, that continues to support so many different efforts for education and advancement and opportunity.
I'm really optimistic and excited about all the new opportunities that we're seeing happening at the surface of the moon, with a lot of robotic exploration and soon to be human exploration, with the Artemis 3 landing and taking astronauts to the South Pole of the moon. I think having astronauts surviving and working in such a rough environment and surviving and learning how to do that will really better inform all of what we're doing or talking about today to push us even further into space and that long-term sustainability of humans being in space. So that's what I'm excited about.
I am in awe by human curiosity and innovation. And so especially from the tourism perspective, what we can achieve in that field. Also from a sports sense, and sports and tourism often go hand in hand. So I'm really curious to see what can be achieved and what can be accomplished in that field. I think I hope I'm alive for it. That would be so awesome to be able to see a brand new sport or sports played in outer space.
It is a good idea. Baseball on the moon.
I can't say why, but I suspect you will see martial arts in 0G in a fairly short amount. The tourism thing, yeah, if you're talking 10 years, that really is the driver. I'm excited about materials on the moon and the asteroids and all that, but that is farther out. The data centers are maybe 10 years out, but the tourism thing's the driver, and I think people really underestimate it. Anybody here know how many people have been on a submarine tourism adventure, meaning they went, say, in a real submarine more than 100 feet down? Anybody know that number? Amy, do you know that number? How many of you think it's more than 100 people? How many of you think it's more than 1,000 people? How many of you think it's more than 1 million people? 18 million people have gone on Atlantis submarines. They run about 20 submarines. They've got like 2 or 3 out of Waikiki. They're in the Bahamas. They're all over the world. They've done 400,000 dives. There's 50, 60 people on a submarine. It's a real business, and we don't even think about it. And amazingly, I know 2 people who went on the crazy Ocean Gate submersible that went to the Titanic before it killed everybody. And those people would go again.
That's a great comparable, actually, submarines.
Yeah. As the mother of a former submariner, I would never do that. He was I took a tour of a fast attack submarine. He was deployed in Guam, and it is not a pleasant experience.
A lot more less than me about right.
Okay. But I am going to also say tourism. I think what I like to think about, and I can't predict the technology 10 years from now, but what I like to think about is the fact that there's some ridiculous number of humans that have lived on Earth, right? It's like 70 billion or something. Of those, just depending on how you count where space begins, just north of 650 have been off the planet. That's such a tiny, tiny fraction. And think about how much our lives have changed just in just 25 years since we've had ISS. As we send more and more humans into space, our lives, whether we ever get to space or not, whether we even care, our lives are going to change immeasurably in ways we cannot even imagine. And that's what excites me. And I'm going to get my rose-tinted glasses now and say, Frank White talks about the overview effect. And we go to space and we see Earth, you physiologically change, your brain physiologically changes. When we have this competition with China, which I love and I'm applauding, we're going to have 2 lunar bases, 2 human communities on the moon, 1 Chinese, 1 American-led, and there's going to be conflict, and then they're going to need each other. And so I think that we are going to have peace from space, and that's the only way we will achieve it on Earth.
So am I allowed to open the panel to questions from the audience? I should have asked before, but is that, maybe you tell me. Yes? Is that a usual thing you do? All right. Sorry, Haley.
Okay, so I would like to ask if you think that space law, space policy is going to be preemptive, or if that's something just aspirate, or if it's simply just going to be retroactive when these conflicts do occur.
Oh, we have mics here. Can you come?
Mike.
Yeah. Okay, let's say that.
Oh, clearly your mic. Do this.
May keep it?
That will what?
You label it.
I think it'll be reactive because I just think that the political will to do it right doesn't exist, and that's unfortunate. There are smart people like Michelle who could really help get it straight, but I think both domestically in the United States and internationally, the political will isn't there to lay it out. So we're gonna F around and find out.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else?
I tend to agree. One thing that I've been curious about is once we are a generation out from people inhabiting off-Earth, how much are we going to have in common with them? And how much is our legal system going to be applicable to their daily experience?
So that's
So I'm not really the best person to answer this. I think Greg and Michelle, and you probably have as well, a lot of insight into this. All I have is secondhand information from talking to entrepreneurs, and they are of the opinion that there's not going to be another treaty to supplement the Outer Space Treaty because the world is too fractured. They tell me that they only barely got the Outer Space Treaty during the Cold War, and it's a very weak treaty. 1 year is all it takes, 1 year notice to withdraw from the treaty, and then you can put weapons of mass destruction in space and claim territory on the moon. 1 year notice is all it takes. And that was the strongest treaty we could get during the Cold War. And so I've heard people arguing we're not going to get a better treaty. And so it's going to be worked out by precedents and by interpreting the existing treaty, trying to create a framework that gains consensus. And that's what the Artemis Accords is attempting to do. Unfortunately, China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran have not agreed to the Artemis Accords, and they're doing their competing approach. So anyways, I think that's where we stand.
I just do want to say that the competing approach, though, in many ways actually aligns with the principles of the Artemis Accords, and our interests are in many ways aligned. So I think we could end up in a bilateral world where there's two different groups who maybe oppose each other on Earth, but in space understand at least what each other's rules means and respect them, whether they adhere to them or not.
So I'm sorry, them's fighting words, Phil. The Outer Space Treaty is not a weak treaty. It's a very, very strong treaty. It's a fantastic treaty. It is a starting point. They would never intend it to solve all of the problems of space, and shame on us for not being able to advance it. But I agree, we're not going to be able to advance it. We're not going to get another binding treaty through the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, where these treaties are negotiated. It took them 25 years to agree to non-binding principles covering remote sensing of Earth, okay? It took them 14 years to come up with debris mitigation guidelines. We are not going to get a binding treaty. We need to work within the framework of the Outer Space Treaty, which provides us tremendous infrastructure. And if you learn how to interpret Article 2 appropriately, you will also be able to figure out property ownership in space. So I think that we are looking at norm building. We are looking at something that's going to be proactive at the industry level. And that's why space needs lawyers, because you have to understand when you go to space that everything you do is setting precedent. And I think it's really, really important that we set the right precedent. Okay, maybe you don't need to be a lawyer to be morally correct, but it helps to have a lawyer there shout out what precedent is that you're forming.
There will never be a movie entitled Space Needs Lawyers, but
Elon, sound like something.
Maybe one more question from the public.
We have talked a lot today about precedent and sort of the history, a little bit of exploration, talking about how people use submarines. We talked about people coming over to America with Columbus. Do you think that maritime law could be used as a framework or the precedent used in maritime law to establish space law, especially excluding celestial bodies? You talked about how the proliferation of nuclear arms and other things don't necessarily fully apply to space. Not nuclear, I'm sorry, just weaponry. Do you think that sort of framework could be adopted in space from maritime law?
I personally think it's promising, particularly in regards to derelict objects in space. I think that the traditional maritime law should be applied to that. If your Zenit rocket booster is still floating around providing a hazard to space, I think anybody that wants to recover that or dispose of it should be allowed to, for instance. I think that would be really useful.
I mean, you need to pick and choose because we also have the International Seabed Authority, which has effectively prevented any deep sea mining, right? And I also think, yes, their maritime law is helpful, but one thing that I really, and you started it, but we really need to categorize space, right? Low Earth orbit is finite. Geostationary orbit is finite. Space is infinite. And so we cannot presume to have laws that apply to all of outer space. So I will say that is one failure of the Outer Space Treaty, because it's like, this law applies everywhere. And we really need to start thinking, okay, do we really care what happens in the asteroid belt? We can't do anything. So let's talk about, code of conduct, right of way. All those kinds of rules are very interesting and informative for space law.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm talking about traditional maritime law, not the law of the sea, which the United States wisely did not sign on to.
Weird question, I think, to end it all. But we talked about precedents, and we talked about how there are two big pressure points or two different sides in the search for people on the moon now. So what happens if the U.S. does not reach lunar settlement before China and Russia do?
The moon is the starting line, right? It's not a finish line. And so I don't buy, people who say, oh, the U.S. has been there, done that, who cares? It will be a tremendous blow to U.S. national pride if China gets their astronauts there first, if they start building the infrastructure first. But and we do have the concern from a legal standpoint of what China will say due regard requires. Well, we need the whole of the South Pole because that's what due regard requires. So there is that fear, but that's why we need to have things like the Artemis Accords in place. We have 59 nations to say, oh no, China, I don't think so, right? But it's really, I can see a world where China puts humans back on the moon first, but I don't see a world where we don't have competing infrastructures, right? I just don't think that the Chinese can build that fast. And I also think it's going to be a huge wake-up call for the United States if they do get their astronauts there first.
I hope it's a wake-up call and not a put-to-sleep call. But that question, I think, will be very important. And I think it's a broader question. It's just not about some resources on the moon or economic development or our national pride. We are at a moment in history that is very similar to the 15th century, the beginning of the age of exploration. And I have a history degree, so pardon me while I digress. But at the beginning of the 15th century, does anybody know who the world's greatest global explorers were in the early 1400s? China. China had huge fleets of ships that far bigger than anything Columbus built. You could take all three of Columbus's ships and put them in one of theirs. And they sent dozens of them at a time with up to 10,000 crew from China all the way across Indonesia, Malaysia, into the Indian Ocean, across the Indian Ocean, all the hit India, the Middle East, and Africa. And they were very, very close to going around the Cape of Good Hope and making it across the Atlantic to the New World. That could have definitely happened, I think, if they continued their exploration program for, say, another 20 years. But in 1430-ish, politicians within the court in Beijing put a stop to the treasure fleet, as it was called, and decided it was a waste of their money. What was the result of that? The Europeans ended up conquering the New World, getting vastly rich doing so, and then spreading themselves across the whole globe and subjugating and colonizing even fairly developed civilizations, including the Chinese, who were eventually subjected to what they call the century of humiliation, which was more than a century under the boot heels of Western powers. They will never, ever let that happen again. They understand that. We need to understand that history too. And we need to understand then, fast forward just a little bit, when the Europeans come out. So the Spanish come out in the late 15th century and start spreading themselves, mostly so that they can steal gold from the indigenous people of the New Worlds and ship it back to Europe. But what was going on in Spain at that time, right? What was the major philosophical mode? They were running the Spanish Inquisition. And they brought that thought process to the governments that they essentially installed throughout Latin America. And to this day, the economic and political outcomes of those people reflect that founding, versus when the British finally started colonizing seriously, it was quite a bit later. And what was happening when they did it in the 18th century? The Enlightenment. And they brought the values of the Scottish Enlightenment and British rule of law. And despite committing many atrocities, which we all know, the countries that were founded under that colonial system are a lot better off politically, stability-wise, and economically. And so we're at that moment. Do we want Xi Jinping thought spreading through the solar system, or do we want the values of diversity and independence and personal liberty that the U.S. represents? And I think it matters a lot. And we may be dysfunctional and have all sorts of problems, but it's much better than Xi Jinping.
All right, so I'll just add one thought to that. Very well said, by the way. I think we have about 10 or 20 years to try to establish a good framework for working on the moon, because the rate that things are happening right now, there's going to be a lot of activity on the moon, a lot of economic activity. The precedents will be set. And it's really crucial for the United States and its allies to be in that process, to be a part of that. And if we sit back and don't participate, then it will be other countries, the authoritarian, autocratic countries, that decide those policies.
All right. I think we're at the end of our time. So thank you so much to our panelists. You definitely have given us a lot to think about. I do agree with what Dr. Autry said earlier, that universities, their role is to bring together experts like you guys are across the board, right, to discuss these issues that are all interconnected. So thank you so much for your good insight and the good discussion today. And thanks to the audience also for good questions. And let's close the panel, the discussion. Thank you.